For the next 25 minutes, I'm going to present to you the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. Just quick hands, how many of you have heard about this? Okay, quite a few. How many have read the 700 pages? Okay. So the Sustainable Finance Framework of the European Commission follows after a series of other legislative and regulation activities that have been happening, not only in Europe but also around the world, and it's going to change the way that we consider responsible investments and what is green in our market. So no more I'm green, I'm sustainable, I'm ESG. That will be regulated from the early 2020, and I'm going to show you the umbrella framework that the European Commission has drafted over the last couple of years. So there's a hashtag here, nice Sustainable Finance EU, according with the Sustainability Forum of Global Sustain. Also, you don't tag this when you talk about sustainable finance now by EU. And there are many, there's much information on the website of EU. I also have some links here that you can consider. So last year, the European Commission presented an action plan for financing sustainable growth as a result to European Commission's commitment to the 2030 agenda, of the SDGs meaning, and the Paris Agreement. Okay, so the European Commission is committed to Paris Agreement SDGs, and there is an investment gap of 180 billion euro per year. The European Commission has, of course, budget for that, which is the European Fund for Strategic Investments. So all the strategic investments by the European Fund are going to be distributed towards this target, but that's not enough. So investors, asset managers, asset owners need to channel their investments toward this investment gap. So the European Commission has actually defined what is ESG. So we have a regulatory definition of sustainability in the terms of investments and corporates. That's for investors and mainly listed firms, okay? But it's also a guide for everyone interested in addressing these issues, especially in the investment and banking industry. So E is an economic activity, whatever is contributed to environmental objectives, and there is a definition what is an environmental objective. And the whole thing I'm going to present is just for the environmental perspective. The social perspective is not included yet. It's going to be developed in the future. And an economic activity is social when we're talking about tackling inequality, social cohesion, integration of labor relations, investment in human capital, socially disadvantaged communities, etc. And the G is when investments are made in companies with good corporate governance, like all these things that we're discussing all day, sound management structures, employee relations, remuneration, tax compliance, etc. Here is the source, the regulation. Okay, the regulation is still on a consultation phase. It will end till December. But this is pretty strict. We don't expect any significant changes to the definition. And what are these ESG criteria? Here's just an example of this. Environmental, all the energy, carbon, biodiversity, water, recycling, waste, what we're talking all day. Social, employee benefits, safety practices, training, diversity, inclusion, etc. And when we talk to governance, board, compensation, shareholder rights, corruption, codes, transparency, etc. The interesting thing is that when an investor, an asset manager, owner, whatever, declares that I do ESG, sustainable, responsible policies, whatever, then it falls into this regulation and it needs to publicly disclose written policies on the integration of this sustainability risk into the investment decision-making process. And that has to be done on the website. Okay, so you need to draft your ESG policy, how you actually integrate all these issues into your investment decision-making process and disclose it publicly. To what extent this is left to the asset company and the investors. So the PRI, for example, is developing guidelines on how this will be acceptable by the market and the regulator. Which are the main now objectives of this legislation? So why did we do it? Why the European Commission needs to regulate the sustainability investment space? Because there's got to be a unified classification system. So if I would go to Germany or France or UK, or if still UK is of course, Denmark, whatever, I would get several definitions on what is sustainable investment, or where should I invest somewhere to be ESG compliant or sustainability compliant or whatever. So now I have a system, a classification system. Yes, this one according to NASA codes, sectors, subsectors, blah, 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 etc. that I can invest in. Improve disclosure requirements, so everyone was saying whatever they wanted, okay, without any accountability. Now they have a framework to refer to. Create new benchmarks. As investors and corporates, we follow benchmarks. These benchmarks now are going to be aligned with this framework. So the Morgan Stanleys, the MSCIs, the Dow Jones, the S&Ps will need to align them benchmarks according to this regulation. We'll avoid greenwashing. So there's no room for greenwashing if you follow this framework. And of course, this will provide the EU for further policy actions, like to develop additional standards, labels, even awards on this framework. Now, there are two main directives that are going to be affected by this regulation. It's the MiFID, the Markets and Financial Instruments Directive, and the Insurance Distribution Directive. So this will need to be aligned according to ESG considerations. That's going to happen next. But the big difference, and these are just the links for your reference, if you click on these active links, you get the regulation. It's a regulation and not a directive. So what are the difference? Anyone? The directive, that's right, takes a long time to be adopted in member states, but the regulation has immediate effect. Like GDPR, okay? So one day we will wake up and we'll say we have the ESG regulation. So this is the new design now for the financial system and how it's going to work. There is a document that's 414 pages. That's a document called Taxonomy. And it has all these economic activities that are considered, that have environmental objectives, okay? And because it's quite long, they also develop it 25 pages, so you can know how to use the big document, okay, and who are the users and where you can find relevant information, blah, blah, blah. Now, because all these things are going to be linked to green bond standards, and green bonds are developed either by financial institutions or from corporates themselves, so a corporate can create a green bond to finance activities. So the European Commission has already come with guidelines on how you can structure a green bond and what are the main principles to be considered. As I said before, all these things follow benchmarks. So the funds follow benchmarks, stock market indexes follow benchmarks, corporates follow benchmarks, portfolios follow benchmarks. So all this need to be aligned with the ESG regulation according to this document. And the last one is an updated document on the non-financial reporting directive. So the non-financial reporting directive, which has been out in the market for a couple of years now, is fully aligned to include the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So TCFD now is part of the regulation, okay? So we have these 5 documents. Now, yes, yes, just take a mic, please. Yeah, feel free to interrupt. Yeah.
Are there any proposals for the system to now expand to social issues, or
not yet? I will tell you the main argument for the regulation about the social aspect is that these all activities included in the big document need to create no harm. Do no harm principle. That's the main thing, okay? But the Commission has said that in the future we're going also to develop another big document for the social activities as well. So the good thing about this legislation is that not totally exclusive, which means that no economic activities are excluded in principle. Just as an investor or an insurance banker or whatever, I need to define how much compliant I will be with the taxonomy. Let me explain. For example, I have 3 companies in my portfolio, okay, and I want to keep them all in my portfolio. I won't exclude anything because of the taxonomy. So I'm trying to see what is the revenue or turnover, sales meaning, of each of the company aligned to the taxonomy. For example, I would say if I'm a public power corporation, a utility, and I operate coal mines, but also coal factories, but also have renewable energies, and 40% only of my power comes from renewable energy sources, this means that I'm 40% compliant to the taxonomy. But if I'm 80% comes from renewable energy sources, I'm 80% compliant or 10% compliant. So this portfolio actually has all 3 companies into its mix, into its universe. So if you do the weighting, then it's 54% compliant to the taxonomy or eligible. This means that you can actually have many more companies or just one or whatever, but at any given point, you need to address and calculate how much compliant you are to the taxonomy, okay? So what will happen at the end is that investors like Trillium or Calvert's or Blacklocks or whatever will create portfolios and will meet client demand that will say, I need to be 100% compliant with the taxonomy, or I need to be at least 50% compliant to that, okay? So all companies are included, and gradually the pressure will be on the companies to increase their revenues that are compliant to the taxonomy. And what is included in the taxonomy so far? Which are the sectors? All right. So the technical expert group has included so far agriculture and forestry, manufacturing, electricity, gas, steam and air conditioning supply, water shortages, waste and remediation, transport, ICT technologies, and buildings. Okay. So, and why we selected only this? Because these activities make a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation, and this means that more additional activities will be included in this when the sustainable finance platform will operate. The Commission has committed that it will create at the beginning of 2020 the sustainable finance platform, including European Investment Bank, other regulators, central banks, etc. These guys will guide this taxonomy, how it's going to be developed in the future. But up till now, we have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 big sectors, which of course have many, many sub-sectors categories that included in the taxonomy. Okay? So if I go to agriculture, for example, and I could dig down to a specific NASA code that's also linked to the Eurostat codes, so we can have the same level of understanding and comparison, I can say what are the environmental benefits of precise agriculture systems. And if I'm an investor and I want to invest in that in a company that's doing precise agriculture, then I'm taxonomy compliant. And this exact document says why this activity is not doing harm, okay? So, the main objectives environmental taxonomy is climate change mitigation and adaptation, okay? And there are more than 150 experts that develop these documents, and in order for an economic activity to be included in this taxonomy, they have to satisfy one of these 6 targets, objectives. either climate change mitigation or adaptation or protection of water and marine resources, circular economy, waste prevention, prevention and control, and health ecosystems. And do no significant harm to the others. So I contribute to the climate change mitigation, but I also protect the healthy ecosystems. Tell me one example. Wind turbines, right? I'm a factory of wind turbines. I contribute to the climate change mitigation, but I also, because I operate in sensitive ecosystems, I need also not to do harm in any of this, okay? So there is all the correlation in the document how all these activities are accepted under this regulation. The other thing, going back to Jeremy's question about social things, is that the taxonomy has also considered minimum social safeguards. And the guiding document for that is the International Labour Organization Declaration of Fundamental Rights and Principles at Work. So this actually is an aggregation of all fundamental rights like collective bargaining, elimination of forced compulsory labor, abolition of child labor, discrimination to employment, etc. So the taxonomy and the regulation says, okay, you can invest in renewable energy companies provided they follow these minimum fundamental rights and principles at work as declared by the ILO. Okay? And at the same time, they do not do significant harm to the communities where they operate. Now, for the first time, I don't remember any other regulations. This is not a regulation written by clerks in Brussels sitting in chairs behind rooms, okay? This is written by the market for the market. These are the people that actually develop the regulation. We're talking about global insurance players, data providers, asset managers, stock exchanges, frameworks like CDP. GRI was part also of the development team. We're talking about development banks. EBRD was also there. The European Investment Bank, central regulators, the EU system. So it's not something that these people do know what they're doing. And they wanted a framework that could like streamline the market, avoid greenwashing, and provide comparability. These are the main uses of the taxonomy. So we're talking about the asset management community, okay? All sorts of investments. Usage funds, alternative investment funds, portfolio management, the insurance industry, corporate investment banking, even venture capital funds, private funds, indexes, and also retail banking through mortgages, securitization loans, etc. So all the lending and investment and insurance community are the primary users of the regulation. Now, that's an interesting thing. When GRI was talking about alignment of frameworks, the European Commission already provided an alignment for the regulatory frameworks. So what we have now is the NFRD, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which also includes the impacts of the company on climate change and potential contribution to targets. And in the inner square, we have the TCFD scope, which provides risks measurement when it comes to transition to a low-carbon economy, but also physical risks, and opportunities for the companies. What are the new products, the new services that companies will need to develop, and technologies in order to meet the low-carbon transition economics objectives? And this is fully aligned in the document, in the fifth document, as I showed earlier before. What metrics now are needed just to comply to both TCFD recommendations and non-financial reporting directive. In the heart of this alignment is governance, okay? You have the business model, but then you need to address governance issues, how all these things will be aligned. That's another interesting slide, how the taxonomy will be used. It will be used by the companies, so the companies will measure their revenue according to the guidelines and check if their activities are sustainable. So there is now a definition what is sustainable, as I said before. And then the financial sector is going to use the benchmarks, the green bond standards, and they're going to disclose the market how they use that according to the taxonomy and their ESG policies they have in place. And investors and citizens are all going to see how this is done, because there's going to be full transparency now. Everyone has the documents, the guides, everyone has now the reporting standards, everyone has now the access to the websites of the users of the taxonomy. And this is going to contribute to a more sustainable future according to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And the Commission has made another commitment that until 2050 it's going to be 100% carbon neutral, which means that there are another trillion euros of investments towards this objective. Well, Global Sustain has an experience in sustainable finance. No need to market this, but we've been working closely with many organizations in Greece and in the United States and Europe on how this all should be streamlined. It's a very interesting time for the market, and happy to take any questions if we have time. Oh, there are questions on the system, yeah.
What gender is the system?
What does buildings in the EU taxonomy refer to? Construction, operation, maintenance, all of the above. It's all of the above. How is significant measured in the do no significant harm? So, for every one of the activities mentioned in the taxonomy, there is a separate box of what is do no harm. For example, if I operate a wind farm, it would say there, no resettling of people, no noise, no disruption to the ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. So for every activity, there is a separate thing about, yeah, can we just unlock this? Yeah. Nice photo, by the way. How did SMEs representing 90% of the EU economy participate in developing the regulation? Okay, let's go back and see who are those who wrote the regulation. Do you think that these people have only big companies in their as clients? Insurance, banking. Okay, even the Unilevers that were part of the regulation in the supply chain.
They are not themselves.
But they have clients. They have clients' considerations. Oh, there are many questions here. Okay, I think that's too complicated, too much information. Yes, I know. It took me a whole summer to read the document, trying to get in 25 minutes. But yes, it's interesting because it could be more complicated, but it's also straightforward. It's not a regulation that you read like a legal document, and believe it or not, if you know your sector, then you will understand what's been said in the document.